So let's start looking at our vector drawing tools. First of all, I wanted to make sure we understood the difference between a pencil line and a brush stroke. So this line was drawn with this pencil tool here, and this line was drawn with the brush tool. They look the same right now, but if you press your K key, it will make our individual vector strokes visible. If we zoom in, we can see that the pencil stroke just has a single vector going through the center of it, whereas the brush stroke has this blue vector line all the way around it. If we use our contour editor tool to select them, we can see the individual vector points that make up those strokes. So in the case of the pencil line, what's happened is it draws a single vector stroke and then determines what the stroke looks like based on these properties and on your pen pressure while you drew it. We'll talk more about these different brush styles when we look at the pencil tool specifically. With the brush tool, however, it just puts down color wherever you place it and creates a whole field of color. The advantage of using pencil lines is that I can come back after the fact with the contour editor tool and move around what I've already drawn. I can either select individual points and drag them, or I can drag the drag handles that define the curve at each point. If I have a shape defined by a pencil line, I can use the contour editor to select individual parts of it. Then I could even delete portions of that stroke. If I use the brush tool to create just a regular field of color, I can still manipulate the points, but it doesn't look like a stroke anymore. There are still definitely lots of cases where you want to use the brush tool though. For outlines though, I would definitely recommend sticking with the pencil tool. So what else can we do with the contour editor tool? Well, if we look over here in our options, we can see that we have our standard options to choose whether we want a lasso or a marquee selection. I would always leave that on lasso. We have our snapping options to determine what happens when we're dragging something. But this next option might be really handy. By default, when you select some points, it just highlights them and lets you move them around. But if you have this option turned on and you select a group of points, you can move them around, but you can also scale them up and rotate them. There are definitely some cases where that can be handy. And our last option here is Apply to Line and Color Art. So this just means it will affect both our line and color art layers at the same time. I'm just working on one layer right now, so this doesn't matter. Now, when you have something selected, your Operations button lights up. The contour editor only has one, Smooth. If you click this, it will try to remove vector points from the shape that you have selected and make it smoother. This is really handy for making your art look a little bit cleaner. Now let's say you have a pencil line and you don't like the look of it. You want to make it something really custom. Well, if you press and hold on the contour editor, we have a group of other options that you can choose from. This next one here is the pencil editor. This lets you treat a pencil line more like a brush stroke. You can come in and grab the individual points and change exactly how the curve goes. You can see you can make some really funky shapes. However, you can still go back to the contour editor and change the shape of the stroke itself. Our next option in this group is the smooth editor. Let's say that we had a crazy shape drawn with the brush tool, and say we wanted to smooth out this top portion. Now we could use the smooth operation we used before, but that will smooth out the entire shape. With the smooth tool, you can just drag over the portion that you want it to try to smooth. It's basically doing the same sort of calculations of that tool, but only within the area you've drawn over. Over here you have different options for the max and min size of the tool, and how strong you want the effect to be. You also have different options here. So instead of defining the area with a brush stroke, you could define it with a selection, such as a lasso. So if I grabbed this, You can see it smoothed whatever was within what I had grabbed. Next in this group, we have the perspective tool. This is a different way of making transformations. So if I select this shape here, you can see I have a transformation box, but instead of just scaling and rotating, it lets me move the individual corners of the selection. So you can see I can create a sense of perspective by moving these corners. The next option is the envelope tool. This is similar, except it gives you even more control. You can move around the corners, and you have these drag handles that let you define curves. The last tool in this group is the Edit Gradient/Texture tool. In addition to flat colors, shapes can be filled with either a gradient of colors or a texture from an image file. We'll go over that more when we talk about coloring. But this tool is used to scale and rotate those special effects. This tool is kind of in a confusing spot since nothing else in this group has to do with color. So when we get to the color lessons, don't forget where it is. Next, now that we're specifically working with vectors, I wanted to show you some additional operations that you have with the regular selection arrow. If we make a selection of a vector, you can see we have these operations here. We have our standard flip and rotate options. And here we have that same smoothing option as before. You can see it makes your shape smoother. And next to that, we have the flatten operation. By default, when you make strokes, it makes them all as separate objects. So you can see, even though these are overlapping, I can select individual lines and move them around. If I were to select this whole group, though, and then press the flatten option, it's now merged them down into a single shape with intersection points here. So now I can only select individual portions of it. And likewise, if I go back to the contour editor tool, I can manipulate individual parts of it. This next option here is to create color art from line art. This is a more complicated one, so I'm going to go over this in the coloring lessons. The next one here is distribute to layers. So if you had multiple things selected, and you chose this option, you can see it added 2 additional drawing layers to the timeline. So those strokes are both on their own layers now. So that's a real easy way to get something to another layer without having to copy and paste. This next option here has to do with storing the positions of a gradient. Again, this is another one we'll go over in the color lessons. This next group of options only applies to pencil strokes. This first option converts a pencil line to a brush line. So if I were to click this, you can see this pencil line now has a stroke around the outside. Let me undo that. Now it's pencil line again. The next option here merges pencil lines together. So let's say I had another pencil line here. If I wanted to merge them together, I could just select both of them and then hit this option. And there, you can see the vector line itself has been merged into a single vector. And this last option reverses the pencil thickness of the stroke. So if I zoom back out, and then apply this operation to this line, you can see it put our thin end at this end instead. That can be really useful when we're doing line art later. The last thing I wanted to go over are different ways that you can use the cutter tool on vector art. So we know by default that when you select something with the cutter tool, it makes it a section that you can break off. But these options here determine what happens when you do it on a vector line. Let's start at this end here. Here you have different options for how your vector lines should end up looking after they've been cut. By default, it's on tip style bevel. So if I cut through a shape at a weird angle, it will make the end of the new strokes that same angle that we cut it at. If I set this to flat, even if I cut it at a crazy angle, it's just going to make the end of both lines flat. And if it's round, it'll make the ends round. You'll have to determine what's right for you depending on the type of art you're doing. This next option is use mouse gesture breaker mode. That's a mouthful, but what it means is, if that's enabled, you can draw a stroke through a line and it automatically breaks it into segments where you cut it. I'm just going to undo that and go back to my cutter tool. That one's kind of dangerous to leave on because you might end up cutting up your line work without meaning to. This next option is a really cool one. Use mouse gesture cutter mode. I would keep this one on by default. So let's say we were using our pencil tool to try to draw a corner. You can see that I overshot the corner by quite a bit. But now with the cutter tool and this option enabled, I can just come here and slice through it, and it trims our strokes down to the intersection. When you're trying to do your final cleaned up line art, this tool is going to be essential. Great, now that we know more about how vector lines work, let's start looking more at the tools that we'll use to create them, the brush tool and the pencil tool.